Welcome to Murder Midnight, a crime storytelling channel for sleeping, where crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. Tonight we have a true crime special focusing on big American cases that lives on through our stories. Before we close our eyes and start, please comment what country you are tuning in from. It will greatly help us here at Murder Midnight. Okay, let's start with story one. The JFK assassination, November 22nd, 1963. The morning of November 22nd, 1963, dawned clear and bright in Dallas, Texas. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy had arrived the previous evening as part of a political fence-mending trip to Texas, a state crucial to his 1964 re-election hopes. What began as a routine campaign visit would end with one of the most shocking and controversial crimes in American history. At 11:40 a.m., President Kennedy, accompanied by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, Texas Governor John Connally, and his wife Nellie, departed Love Field aboard a blue Lincoln Continental convertible. The decision to keep the top down, despite security concerns, was made to maximize the president's visibility to the enthusiastic crowds lining the motorcade route. The presidential limousine, designated SS-100X by the Secret Service, moved slowly through downtown Dallas at approximately 11 miles per hour. Crowds of spectators cheered and waved as the popular young president and his glamorous wife passed by. Mrs. Kennedy, wearing a pink Chanel suit and matching pillbox hat, sat to the president's left, while Governor and Mrs. Connally occupied the jump seats in front of them. As the motorcade approached Dealey Plaza at 12:30 p.m., it made a sharp left turn from Main Street onto Elm Street, bringing it directly past the 7-story Texas School Book Depository building. The crowds had thinned somewhat in this area, and the limousine was accelerating to highway speed for the final leg to the Trade Mart, where President Kennedy was scheduled to deliver a luncheon address. At approximately 12:30 p.m., the first shot rang out. Many witnesses later described hearing what sounded like a firecracker or a motorcycle backfiring. President Kennedy, who had been waving to spectators on the right side of the car, suddenly stopped mid-gesture and appeared to clutch at his throat. Governor Connally, sitting directly in front of the president, turned to look back and was himself struck by what appeared to be a second shot. "My God, they're going to kill us all!" Connally reportedly cried out as he slumped forward in his seat, severely wounded but conscious. Mrs. Kennedy, initially confused by what was happening, leaned toward her husband as he slumped leftward. Then came the third and most devastating shot. The final bullet struck President Kennedy in the head with devastating force, causing massive trauma that was visible to everyone in the immediate vicinity. The impact threw the president violently backward and to the left, while blood and brain matter sprayed across the rear of the limousine and the accompanying Secret Service agents. In a moment that would be replayed countless times in the decades to follow, Mrs. Kennedy could be seen climbing onto the trunk of the moving limousine, apparently trying to retrieve a piece of her husband's skull. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, running alongside the car, pushed her back into her seat and shielded the president's body with his own as the limousine accelerated toward Parkland Hospital. "They've killed my husband," Mrs. Kennedy screamed. "I have his brains in my hands." The entire attack had lasted no more than 8 seconds, but those few moments would forever change American history and launch decades of investigation, controversy, and conspiracy theories. Even as President Kennedy fought for his life at Parkland Hospital, law enforcement agencies were mobilizing what would become one of the largest criminal investigations in American history. The initial focus centered on the Texas School Book Depository, where several witnesses reported seeing a rifle being fired from a 6th-floor window. Dallas police officer Marion Baker, who had been riding a motorcycle in the presidential motorcade, immediately drove to the book depository and, along with building superintendent Roy Truly, began searching the building floor by floor. Other officers secured the perimeter and began interviewing witnesses. At 1 p.m., 30 minutes after the shooting, President Kennedy was pronounced dead at Parkland Hospital. The cause of death was listed as a gunshot wound to the head. Governor Connally, though seriously wounded, would survive his injuries. At 1:15 p.m., Dallas police officer J.D. Tippett was shot and killed in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas while questioning a suspicious pedestrian. Witnesses described the shooter as a young man who fled on foot after killing the officer. At 1:50 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old employee of the Texas School Book Depository, was arrested at the Texas Theater in Oak Cliff in connection with Officer Tippett's murder. Oswald had left the book depository shortly after the assassination and had been seen acting suspiciously in the neighborhood where Tippett was killed. By 6:05 p.m. that evening, Oswald had been formally charged with the murder of President Kennedy. The case against Lee Harvey Oswald appeared straightforward to investigators. A wealth of physical and circumstantial evidence pointed to him as the lone gunman who had fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. The murder weapon was discovered at 1:22 p.m. on the 6th floor of the book depository, a 6.5 mm Mannlicher Carcano rifle that had been ordered by mail from Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago. The rifle had been purchased under the alias A. Heidel, and handwriting analysis confirmed that Oswald had filled out the order form. 3 spent cartridge cases were found near the 6th floor window from which the shots were fired. Ballistics testing would later confirm that these cases had been fired from Oswald's rifle, and that bullet fragments recovered from the presidential limousine and from Governor Connolly's stretcher at Parkland Hospital were consistent with ammunition fired from the same weapon. Fingerprint evidence also linked Oswald to the crime scene. A palm print matching Oswald's was discovered on the rifle barrel, and several fingerprints matching Oswald were found on boxes that had been arranged to create a sniper's nest near the 6th floor window. Witnesses placed Oswald in the building at the time of the shooting. He was seen on the 6th floor by several co-workers that morning, and Building Superintendent Roy Truly encountered him in the 2nd floor lunchroom just moments after the assassination. Remarkably calm for someone who had supposedly just committed the crime of the century. Perhaps most damning was Oswald's behavior after the shooting. Rather than remaining at his job or cooperating with the investigation, he left the building, went to his rooming house to retrieve a pistol, and then killed police officer Tippett when confronted. His subsequent arrest at the movie theater while armed with the murder weapon suggested consciousness of guilt. The most crucial piece of evidence in the Kennedy assassination was captured entirely by accident. Abraham Zapruder, a Dallas dress manufacturer, had brought his 8mm home movie camera to Dealey Plaza to film the president's motorcade. Standing on a concrete pedestal with an unobstructed view of Elm Street, Zapruder recorded 26.6 seconds of film that would become the most analyzed piece of footage in history. The Zapruder film provided investigators with a precise timeline of the shooting and visual confirmation of the president's wounds. Frame-by-frame analysis showed that President Kennedy was first hit at frame 223, when he disappeared behind a road sign, emerged clearly wounded at frame 230, and suffered the fatal headshot at frame 313. The film also captured Governor Connolly's reaction to being shot, which appeared to occur at roughly the same time as the president's first wound. This timing would become crucial to the investigation, as it suggested that a single bullet had caused multiple wounds to both men, a conclusion that would prove highly controversial. The backward motion of President Kennedy's head after the fatal shot, clearly visible in the film, would fuel decades of speculation about the direction from which the shots were fired. Critics argued that the violent rearward movement indicated a shot from the front, contradicting the official conclusion that all shots came from behind. Following President Kennedy's death, President Lyndon Johnson established the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, commonly known as the Warren Commission after its chairman, Chief Justice Earl Warren. The commission was tasked with conducting a thorough investigation of the assassination and providing the American people with a definitive account of what had happened. The Warren Commission spent 10 months investigating the assassination, interviewing 552 witnesses, taking testimony from 94 witnesses, and reviewing thousands of documents and pieces of physical evidence. The Commission's 888-page report, released in September 1964, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone in killing President Kennedy. The Commission's key findings included single bullet theory. The Commission concluded that the same bullet that caused President Kennedy's back and throat wounds also caused all of Governor Connolly's wounds. This theory was necessary to explain how one gunman could have caused all the documented injuries within the time constraints established by the Zapruder film. 3 shots total. The Commission determined that Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. The first shot missed entirely. The second shot hit both Kennedy and Connolly, and the third shot caused Kennedy's fatal head wound. No conspiracy. After extensive investigation, the commission found no evidence of a conspiracy involving Oswald or any other parties. They concluded that Oswald acted alone in planning and carrying out the assassination. Motive. The commission identified several possible motives for Oswald's actions, including his Marxist political beliefs, his troubled personal relationships, and his desire for notoriety. However, they acknowledged that Oswald's exact motivation might never be fully understood. On November 24, 1963, as Lee Harvey Oswald was being transferred from Dallas Police Headquarters to the county jail, he was shot and killed by Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner. The shooting occurred in the basement of the police station and was broadcast live on national television, adding another layer of shock and mystery to an already stunning case. Ruby approached Oswald as he was being escorted by police officers and fired a single shot from a .38 caliber revolver into Oswald's abdomen. Oswald died at Parkland Hospital, the same hospital where President Kennedy had died 2 days earlier. Ruby claimed he killed Oswald to spare Mrs. Kennedy the ordeal of a trial. He maintained that he acted spontaneously and alone, driven by grief over the president's death and anger at Oswald. However, Ruby's connections to organized crime figures and his presence at Dallas Police Headquarters during the weekend of the assassination raised questions about whether his actions were part of a larger conspiracy. The Warren Commission investigated Ruby extensively and concluded that he had acted alone, with no connection to Oswald prior to the assassination. However, Ruby's killing of the primary suspect ensured that many questions about the assassination would never be answered, as Oswald never had the opportunity to explain his actions or defend himself in court. Despite the Warren Commission's definitive conclusions, the Kennedy assassination quickly became the subject of intense scrutiny and alternative theories. Critics pointed to various pieces of evidence that they argued contradicted the official findings. The magic bullet. The single bullet theory became a particular target of criticism. Skeptics argued that it was physically impossible for one bullet to have caused 7 wounds in 2 men while remaining in relatively pristine condition. The bullet recovered from Governor Connolly's stretcher at Parkland Hospital showed minimal deformation despite allegedly passing through bone and tissue. Acoustic evidence. Analysis of police radio recordings from Dealey Plaza suggested the possibility of a 4th shot, which would indicate multiple gunmen. However, later analysis of the acoustic evidence proved inconclusive. Witness testimony. Many witnesses reported hearing shots from directions other than the book depository, and some claimed to have seen suspicious activity on the grassy knoll in front of the presidential limousine. However, witness testimony proved notoriously unreliable, with many contradictory accounts. The president's wounds. Some medical personnel at Parkland Hospital described Kennedy's throat wound as an entrance wound, which would indicate a shot from the front. However, the official autopsy concluded that all wounds were caused by shots from behind. Photographic evidence. Analysis of photographs and films from Dealey Plaza led some researchers to claim they could identify additional gunmen or suspicious figures. However, none of these claims have been definitively proven. In 1976, amid growing public skepticism about the Warren Commission's findings, the House of Representatives established the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, to reinvestigate both the Kennedy assassination and the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. The HSCA spent 2 years re-examining the evidence and ultimately reached conclusions that both supported and contradicted the Warren Commission's findings. The committee agreed that Lee Harvey Oswald had fired the shots that killed President Kennedy, but concluded that he probably did not act alone. The HSCA's conclusion was based primarily on acoustic evidence that suggested a 4th shot had been fired from the grassy knoll. However, this evidence was later disputed by the National Academy of Sciences, which concluded that the acoustic analysis was flawed. Despite finding a probable conspiracy, the HSCA was unable to identify any other gunmen or conspirators. The committee's final report acknowledged that while they believed a conspiracy was likely, they could not prove it or identify the other participants. More than 60 years after President Kennedy's death, the assassination remains one of the most controversial events in American history. Polls consistently show that a majority of Americans believe there was a conspiracy to kill the president, despite the lack of conclusive evidence supporting such theories. The assassination marked a turning point in American culture, representing the end of an era of innocence and trust in government institutions. The shocking nature of the crime, combined with the subsequent murder of the primary suspect, created an atmosphere of suspicion and conspiracy that has persisted for decades. The Kennedy assassination also demonstrated the power of television and visual media to shape public perception. The Zapruder film, broadcast repeatedly in the years following the assassination, provided Americans with a visceral, immediate experience of the president's death that previous generations could never have had. Modern forensic techniques have been applied to the Kennedy assassination evidence with mixed results. Computer analysis of the Zapruder film has provided more precise timing of the shots, while ballistics testing has confirmed that the bullet fragments were fired from Oswald's rifle. However, the passage of time has also made certain types of analysis impossible. Much of the original physical evidence has degraded, and many key witnesses have died. The opportunity to resolve the case definitively through modern scientific methods may have been lost. Recent releases of previously classified documents have provided additional details about the investigation, but have not fundamentally changed the conclusions reached by previous investigations. While the documents have revealed government cover-ups of unrelated activities, they have not produced evidence of a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald remains as much of an enigma today as he was in 1963. His background, a troubled childhood, military service in the Marines, defection to the Soviet Union, and return to the United States, provided numerous theories about his possible motivations and connections. Oswald's political beliefs were complex and sometimes contradictory. He had expressed admiration for both Communist Cuba and President Kennedy, making his motivation for the assassination unclear. His attempt to visit Cuba just weeks before the assassination has led to speculation about possible foreign involvement, but no definitive evidence has emerged. Perhaps most frustrating for investigators and the public is that Oswald maintained his innocence until his death, claiming he was a patsy who had been set up to take the blame for the assassination. His death at the hands of Jack Ruby ensured that his version of events would never be heard. The assassination of President Kennedy remains one of the most significant crimes in American history, not just because of its impact on the nation, but because of the questions it continues to raise about truth, evidence, and the nature of conspiracy. The official investigations concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing President Kennedy, and the physical evidence supporting this conclusion is substantial. However, the shocking nature of the crime, the subsequent murder of the alleged assassin, and various inconsistencies in witness testimony have fueled decades of speculation and alternative theories. Whether one accepts the official conclusion or believes in a conspiracy, the Kennedy assassination serves as a watershed moment in American history, the point at which many Americans began to question the official accounts provided by their government and to suspect that powerful forces might be operating beyond public scrutiny. The ultimate truth about November 22, 1963, may never be fully known, but the quest to understand what happened in Dallas that day continues to reveal important truths about American society, the nature of political power, and the human need to find meaning in tragedy. Today, as the last witnesses to the assassination pass away and the events recede further into history, the Kennedy assassination remains a defining moment in the American experience, a reminder of how quickly the world can change and how some questions may never be fully answered, no matter how intensively they are investigated. The shots fired in Dealey Plaza on that November afternoon didn't just kill a president, they shattered America's sense of security and innocence, launching the country into an era of suspicion and doubt that continues to shape our politics and culture today. Story 2. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. April 4th, 1968. The evening of April 4th, 1968, found Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee, preparing for what would be his final public appearance. The 39-year-old civil rights leader had come to Memphis to support striking sanitation workers, continuing his lifelong commitment to economic justice and nonviolent protest. As he stood on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel, joking with colleagues and preparing for dinner, few could have imagined that within minutes, one of America's greatest moral leaders would be dead. Dr. King had arrived in Memphis on April 3rd, despite receiving numerous death threats and warnings from the FBI about potential violence. The city was tense following weeks of strikes by predominantly African-American sanitation workers, who were demanding better wages, working conditions, and union recognition under the slogan, "I am a man." The previous evening, Dr. King had delivered what would become known as his mountaintop speech to a packed crowd at Mason Temple. In words that would prove eerily prophetic, he spoke of having been to the mountaintop and seeing the promised land, while acknowledging he might not get there with his followers. The speech, delivered during a thunderstorm with dramatically flickering lights, concluded with King declaring, "I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." April 4th began routinely for Dr. King and his entourage at the Lorraine Motel. The motel, owned by Walter Bailey, was a popular accommodation for African-American travelers during the era of segregation and had become Dr. King's preferred lodging when visiting Memphis. He was staying in room 306, a modest accommodation that he had occupied during previous visits to the city. Throughout the day, Dr. King met with local civil rights leaders, ministers, and strike supporters to plan strategy for upcoming demonstrations. Despite the threats against his life, he appeared relaxed and in good spirits, even engaging in a pillow fight with his aides during the afternoon. At approximately 5:30 p.m., Dr. King began preparing for dinner at the home of Reverend Samuel Billy Kiles, a local minister and civil rights activist. As was his custom, Dr. King was running late, and his colleagues were gathered in the motel courtyard below, waiting for him to come down. Dr. King emerged from his room onto the balcony at approximately 6 p.m. He was wearing a black suit and white shirt, having changed from the more casual clothes he had worn during the day. The evening was pleasant, with temperatures in the 60s and clear skies. Standing on the balcony, Dr. King called down to musician Ben Branch, who was in the courtyard below. "Ben, make sure you play 'Take My Hand, Precious Lord' in the meeting tonight. Play it real pretty." Those would be the last words Martin Luther King Jr. ever spoke. At 6:01 p.m., a single rifle shot rang out across the motel complex. The bullet struck Dr. King in the right cheek and jaw, severing his spinal cord and causing massive trauma to his neck and lower face. The force of the impact knocked him backward onto the balcony floor. The shot had come from across Mulberry Street, from a boarding house that overlooked the Lorraine Motel. Dr. King's colleagues immediately rushed to his aid, finding him lying unconscious with severe bleeding from his facial wounds. Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King's closest friend and lieutenant, cradled King's head as others called for an ambulance. Dr. King was conscious but unable to speak due to his injuries. His eyes remained open, and he appeared to recognize those around him, but the wound had left him unable to communicate. "Martin, this is Ralph," Abernathy whispered to his friend. "Don't be afraid." The ambulance arrived within minutes, and Dr. King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, the nearest medical facility. Despite the efforts of a team of doctors, the wound proved fatal. At 7:05 p.m., exactly 1 hour and 4 minutes after being shot, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. Even as doctors worked frantically to save Dr. King's life, Memphis police and FBI agents were launching what would become one of the largest manhunts in American history. The investigation began at the rooming house across from the Lorraine Motel, where witnesses had seen a man flee shortly after the shooting. The boarding house at 422.5 South Main Street was a rundown establishment that catered to transient workers and individuals seeking cheap, anonymous accommodation. The proprietor, Bessie Brewer, told investigators that a man identifying himself as John Willard had rented room 5B earlier that day, specifically requesting a room that faced the back of the building toward the Lorraine Motel. In the shared bathroom adjacent to room 5B, investigators found evidence that someone had knocked out a screen and used the window as a shooting position. The bathroom provided an unobstructed view of the Lorraine Motel's second-floor balcony, and the angle was consistent with the trajectory of the bullet that killed Dr. King. Outside the boarding house, in the doorway of Canapé Amusement Company, investigators discovered a bundle of evidence that would prove crucial to identifying the assassin. The bundle contained a Remington .30 .06 rifle with a telescopic sight, a pair of binoculars, personal items including clothing and toiletries, newspapers and magazines, a transistor radio, The rifle was quickly determined to be the murder weapon. Ballistics tests confirmed that the bullet fragments recovered from Dr. King's body had been fired from this specific weapon. The serial number led investigators to Aero Marine Supply Company in Birmingham, Alabama, where the rifle had been purchased on March 30th, 1968, just 5 days before the assassination. The purchaser of the rifle had used the alias Harvey Lohmeyer, but fingerprints found on the weapon and other evidence in the bundle led investigators to identify the real buyer, James Earl Ray, a 40-year-old escaped convict with a history of petty crimes and robbery. Ray had escaped from Missouri State Penitentiary on April 23, 1967, nearly a year before the assassination. During his time as a fugitive, he had assumed multiple false identities, traveled extensively, and somehow acquired the funds and resources necessary to stalk Dr. King and plan the assassination. The FBI launched a massive international manhunt for Ray, placing him on their 10 most wanted list and offering substantial rewards for information leading to his capture. The investigation revealed that Ray had been following Dr. King's movements for several weeks, checking into hotels and rooming houses in cities where King was scheduled to appear. Ray's movements prior to the assassination were meticulously reconstructed by investigators. March 29, 1968. Ray arrived in Memphis and checked into a hotel near the Lorraine Motel. March 30th, 1968. Ray purchased the murder weapon in Birmingham, Alabama. April 3rd, 1968. Ray returned to Memphis and rented a room at the South Main Street boarding house. April 4th, 1968. Ray shot Dr. King and fled Memphis immediately afterward. Following the assassination, Ray fled Memphis in a white Ford Mustang he had purchased earlier under the alias Eric Starvo Galt. His escape route took him through several states as law enforcement agencies coordinated their pursuit. Ray abandoned the Mustang in Atlanta, Georgia, and continued his flight using public transportation and assumed identities. His ability to evade capture for over 2 months demonstrated a level of planning and preparation that surprised investigators. On June 8, 1968, Ray was captured at London's Heathrow Airport while attempting to board a flight to Brussels, Belgium. He was traveling under the false identity of Ramon George Snide and carrying a Canadian passport. British authorities detained him based on the passport irregularities, and he was quickly identified as the fugitive James Earl Ray. The circumstances of Ray's capture raised questions about how he had obtained false documentation and funding for international travel. Ray, who had previously demonstrated little sophistication in his criminal activities, had somehow managed to acquire professional quality fake identities and had traveled to Canada, Portugal, and the United Kingdom while evading one of the largest manhunts in FBI history. Ray was extradited to the United States and charged with the first-degree murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Facing the possibility of the death penalty in Tennessee, Ray's attorney, Percy Foreman, negotiated a plea bargain with prosecutors. On March 10, 1969, Ray appeared before Judge Preston Battle in Memphis and entered a guilty plea to the murder charge. In exchange for his plea, Ray received a sentence of 99 years in prison, avoiding the electric chair. During the hearing, Ray acknowledged his role in Dr. King's death, but provided few details about his motivations or whether he had assistance from others. However, just 3 days after entering his guilty plea, Ray attempted to recant, claiming he had been pressured into the plea agreement and that he was innocent of Dr. King's murder. Ray would spend the remainder of his life claiming that he had been a patsy in a larger conspiracy and that the real killers had escaped justice. Ray's claims centered on a mysterious figure he called Raoul, whom he said had manipulated him into purchasing the rifle and positioning himself in Memphis on the day of the assassination. According to Ray, Raoul had promised him money for what Ray believed was a gun-running operation, only to use Ray as a scapegoat for the assassination. Despite extensive investigation, no evidence was ever found to support the existence of Raoul or Ray's claims of innocence. Law enforcement agencies concluded that Ray had fabricated the story to deflect responsibility for his actions. In the years following Ray's conviction, members of the King family, particularly Dr. King's widow Coretta Scott King and his son Dexter King, became convinced that Ray had not acted alone in the assassination. They pointed to various inconsistencies in the official account and argued that a broader conspiracy had been responsible for Dr. King's death. The King family's suspicions were fueled by several factors: FBI surveillance and harassment. It was later revealed that the FBI had conducted extensive surveillance of Dr. King and had attempted to discredit him through various means, including wiretapping, break-ins, and psychological warfare. The FBI's COINTELPRO program had targeted Dr. King and other civil rights leaders as potential threats to national security. Government secrecy. Many documents related to the assassination and the investigation remained classified for decades, leading to suspicions about what information was being withheld from the public. Ray's limited resources. Questions persisted about how Ray, a small-time criminal with limited funds, had managed to finance his extended travels, acquire multiple false identities, and obtain sophisticated documentation for international travel. Ballistics evidence. Some experts questioned whether the bullet fragments recovered from Dr. King's body could definitively be matched to Ray's rifle, though the FBI maintained that the ballistics evidence was conclusive. In 1977, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, was established to reinvestigate both the Kennedy and King assassinations. The committee's investigation into Dr. King's death was extensive, reviewing thousands of documents and interviewing hundreds of witnesses. The HSCA's final report, released in 1979, reached several significant conclusions. Ray as the assassin. The committee confirmed that James Earl Ray had fired the shot that killed Dr. King and had acted as the primary perpetrator of the assassination. Probable conspiracy. However, the committee concluded that there was a likelihood that Ray had not acted alone and that a conspiracy involving Ray and unknown co-conspirators was responsible for Dr. King's death. Bounty theory. The committee found evidence suggesting that two businessmen from St. Louis, John Sutherland and John Kaufman, had offered a bounty for Dr. King's death, though they could not definitively link this to Ray's actions. Limited evidence. Despite concluding that a conspiracy was likely, the committee acknowledged that they had found insufficient evidence to identify any specific co-conspirators or to recommend additional prosecutions. In the decades following the HSCA investigation, additional information emerged that both supported and contradicted various conspiracy theories surrounding Dr. King's assassination. FBI documents. The release of previously classified FBI documents confirmed the extent of the Bureau's surveillance and harassment of Dr. King. The documents revealed that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had viewed King as a significant threat and had authorized extensive efforts to discredit him. However, no evidence was found linking the FBI directly to the assassination. Military intelligence. Documents revealed that U.S. military intelligence units had been monitoring Dr. King and other civil rights leaders, and that military personnel had been present in Memphis on the day of the assassination. However, investigators found no evidence that military units were involved in the killing. Witness testimony. Over the years, various individuals came forward claiming knowledge of conspiracies involving the assassination. However, most of these claims were found to be unsubstantiated or contradicted by physical evidence. In 1999, the King family pursued a civil lawsuit against Lloyd Jowers, a Memphis restaurant owner who had claimed knowledge of a conspiracy to kill Dr. King. Jowers alleged that he had been paid to participate in the assassination and that government agencies had been involved in the plot. The civil trial, which lasted 4 weeks, heard testimony from numerous witnesses claiming knowledge of various conspiracies. The jury ultimately ruled in favor of the King family, finding that government agencies had been involved in Dr. King's assassination. However, the verdict was widely criticized by legal experts and journalists, who noted that the case was essentially uncontested. Neither Ray, who had died in prison in 1998, nor any government agencies mounted a serious defense. The evidence presented was largely hearsay and speculation, and the low burden of proof in civil cases made the verdict less significant than it might have appeared. Following the civil trial verdict, the U.S. Department of Justice conducted its own review of the assassination evidence, releasing a comprehensive report in 2000. The Justice Department's investigation concluded, Ray's guilt. All available evidence continued to point to James Earl Ray as Dr. King's assassin, and no credible evidence existed to support claims that he was innocent or had been framed. No government conspiracy. The investigation found no evidence that government agencies were involved in planning or executing Dr. King's assassination, despite the FBI's well-documented harassment of King during his lifetime. Conspiracy claims unfounded. The various conspiracy theories that had emerged over the decades were found to be based on unreliable testimony, speculation, or misinterpretation of evidence. Case closed. The Justice Department concluded that no further investigation was warranted and that James Earl Ray had acted alone in assassinating Dr. King. Understanding James Earl Ray's background and motivations remains crucial to comprehending the assassination. Ray was born in 1928 into poverty in rural Illinois, one of 9 children in a family marked by dysfunction and criminal behavior. His father, George Ellis Ray, was an abusive alcoholic with a criminal record, and several of Ray's siblings also had histories of legal troubles. Ray's own criminal career began in his teens with petty thefts and burglaries. He served in the U.S. Army during the occupation of Germany, but was discharged for ineptness and lack of adaptability. His criminal activities escalated over time, leading to multiple prison sentences for armed robbery and other offenses. Ray held strong racist views throughout his life, though the extent to which these beliefs motivated the assassination remains debated. Former associates described him as someone who used racial slurs frequently and expressed hatred for the civil rights movement. However, some observers noted that Ray's racism seemed to intensify after his arrest, possibly as a way of gaining acceptance from white supremacist inmates. The psychological profile that emerged of Ray painted him as an inadequate individual who craved recognition and importance. Some experts suggested that assassinating Dr. King represented Ray's attempt to achieve the notoriety that had eluded him throughout his life of petty crimes. Dr. King's assassination came at a crucial moment in the civil rights movement and American history. The killing occurred during a period of increasing social tension, just 4 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and 3 years after the Voting Rights Act. King's death represented the loss of the movement's most prominent advocate for nonviolent change. The immediate reaction to the assassination was widespread rioting in over 100 cities across the United States. The violence, which lasted for several days, resulted in dozens of deaths, thousands of injuries, and millions of dollars in property damage. The riots represented a tragic irony. The apostle of nonviolence had been killed, and his death had sparked the very violence he had spent his life opposing. The assassination also marked a turning point in the civil rights movement, with many younger activists abandoning King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance in favor of more militant approaches. Organizations like the Black Panthers gained prominence, advocating for armed self-defense and revolutionary change rather than the peaceful integration that King had championed. More than 5 decades after Dr. King's assassination, certain questions about the case remain unresolved, though the basic facts are well established. James Earl Ray shot and killed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. The physical evidence supporting this conclusion is overwhelming and has been confirmed by multiple investigations. However, questions persist about Ray's motivations, his ability to finance his activities as a fugitive, and whether he received assistance from others. These questions reflect broader concerns about the official accounts of political assassinations during the turbulent 1960s and the role of government agencies in monitoring and harassing civil rights leaders. The King assassination also raises uncomfortable questions about American society's tolerance for violence against those who challenge existing power structures. Dr. King had faced death threats throughout his career, and his assassination occurred during a period when other prominent leaders, including President Kennedy and Senator Robert Kennedy, were also killed by assassins. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. represents one of the darkest moments in American history, the violent silencing of a voice that had called the nation to live up to its highest ideals of equality and justice. While James Earl Ray pulled the trigger that ended Dr. King's life, the broader responsibility for the assassination extends to a society that had allowed hatred and racism to flourish. The investigation into Dr. King's death, while extensive and thorough, has not satisfied all questions about the case. The various conspiracy theories that have emerged over the decades reflect both legitimate concerns about government secrecy and the difficulty many Americans have in accepting that a single, disturbed individual could alter the course of history through one act of violence. What remains indisputable is the profound impact that Dr. King's death had on American society and the civil rights movement. His assassination robbed the nation of a moral leader who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice through peaceful means. The violence that followed his death served as a tragic reminder of how far the country still had to travel toward the promised land that King had envisioned. Today, as America continues to grapple with issues of racial justice and equality, Dr. King's assassination serves as both a reminder of how much progress has been made and how much work remains to be done. The man who dreamed of a nation where people would be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin was silenced by hatred. But his message continues to resonate more than half a century after his death. The shots fired at the Lorraine Motel on that April evening in 1968 ended the life of one of America's greatest moral leaders, but they could not kill the dream he had articulated so eloquently. In that sense, while James Earl Ray succeeded in murdering Martin Luther King Jr., he failed in his ultimate goal of stopping the movement toward racial justice and equality that King had championed. The investigation into Dr. King's assassination may never answer every question about the case, but it has provided clear evidence of who was responsible for one of the most consequential crimes in American history. Understanding that crime and its lasting impact on American society remains essential to understanding the ongoing struggle for civil rights and social justice in America. Story 3. The assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, June 5, 1968. The Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles was alive with celebration on the evening of June 5, 1968. Senator Robert Francis Kennedy had just won the California Democratic primary, a crucial victory that revived his flagging presidential campaign and put him back in contention for his party's nomination. As RFK made his way through the hotel's kitchen after delivering his victory speech, few could have imagined that within moments America would lose another Kennedy to an assassin's bullet. The assassination of Robert Kennedy came just 2 months after the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and 5 years after his brother, President John F. Kennedy, had been killed in Dallas. The shooting would rob America of a political leader who many believed could heal the divisions that were tearing the country apart during one of its most turbulent periods. Robert Kennedy's 1968 presidential campaign had been born from the trauma and divisions of the Vietnam War era. Initially reluctant to challenge President Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy had entered the race in March 1968, just days after Senator Eugene McCarthy's strong showing in the New Hampshire primary had demonstrated Johnson's political vulnerability. Kennedy's campaign attracted passionate support from diverse constituencies: African Americans, Hispanics, working-class whites, college students, and anti-war activists. His message of healing America's racial and economic divisions, combined with his opposition to the Vietnam War, had created a coalition that many believed could capture the presidency. The California primary was crucial to Kennedy's hopes. After losing the Oregon primary to McCarthy, the first electoral defeat in the Kennedy family's political history, RFK needed a decisive victory in California to maintain momentum heading into the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. On June 4, 1968, Kennedy campaigned tirelessly across California, making multiple appearances and ending with a rally at the Ambassador Hotel. Early returns showed Kennedy leading McCarthy by a significant margin, and by evening, it was clear that he had won a decisive victory that would give him crucial delegates and renewed momentum. At approximately 11:30 p.m. on June 5th, Kennedy took the stage in the embassy room of the Ambassador Hotel to address his jubilant supporters. The crowd of over 1,800 people packed the ballroom, many standing on chairs and tables to catch a glimpse of the senator. Kennedy's speech was brief but optimistic, lasting only about 6 minutes. He thanked his supporters, acknowledged the contributions of various groups to his victory, and looked ahead to the challenges facing America. "I think we can end the divisions within the United States," Kennedy told the cheering crowd. "What I think is quite clear is that we can work together in the last analysis, and that what has been going on within the United States over the period of the last 3 years, the divisions, the violence, the disenchantment with our society, the divisions whether it's between blacks and whites, between the poor and the more affluent, or between age groups or on the war in Vietnam, that we can start to work together." Kennedy concluded his speech by saying, "So my thanks to all of you, and on to Chicago, and let's win there." Oh, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Kennedy waved and prepared to leave the stage. After finishing his speech, Kennedy was scheduled to attend a press conference in the colonial room of the hotel. To avoid the crowds in the embassy room, hotel staff and Kennedy's security team decided to take him through the hotel's kitchen and pantry area, a route that would prove fatally consequential. The decision to go through the kitchen was made hastily and was not part of the original security plan. Kennedy's bodyguard, former FBI agent William Barry, would later say that he had objected to the route but had been overruled by hotel staff who insisted it was the quickest way to the press conference. The kitchen route took Kennedy and his entourage through a narrow pantry area that connected the embassy room to the colonial room. The pantry was cramped with stainless steel equipment and food preparation areas lining both sides of the narrow passage. As Kennedy moved through the kitchen, he was surrounded by campaign workers, hotel employees, journalists, and well-wishers. The security in the area was minimal. Kennedy had no Secret Service protection. Presidential candidates did not receive Secret Service protection at that time, and his small security team was overwhelmed by the crowd and the confined space. At approximately 12:15 a.m. on June 6, 1968, as Kennedy paused in the pantry to shake hands with hotel employees, a young man approached him from the right side. The man, later identified as Sirhan Bashara Sirhan, was holding a .22 caliber Ever Johnson revolver. "Kennedy, you son of a bitch!" Sirhan reportedly shouted as he opened fire at point-blank range. The first shot struck Kennedy behind the right ear, causing massive brain damage. Sirhan continued firing rapidly, emptying his 8-shot revolver in a matter of seconds. In addition to Kennedy, 5 other people were wounded by the gunfire. Paul Schrade, a Kennedy campaign worker, William Weisel, an ABC News associate producer, Ira Goldstein, a Continental News Service reporter, Elizabeth Evans, a campaign volunteer, and Erwin Stroll, a teenage campaign volunteer. The pantry erupted in chaos as people screamed, dove for cover, and tried to escape the confined space. Kennedy collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath his head as his wife Ethel rushed to his side. Several men in the pantry immediately tackled Sirhan, wrestling the gun away from him as he continued to struggle. Roosevelt Greer, a former NFL player who was working as an informal bodyguard for Kennedy, was among those who subdued the assassin. Olympic athlete Rayford Johnson also helped restrain Sirhan as others called for medical help. "Is everybody okay?" Kennedy reportedly asked as he lay on the floor, even as he was losing consciousness from his massive head wound. Kennedy was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital, just 5 minutes away from the Ambassador Hotel. Dr. Henry Cuneo, the chief of surgery, led the medical team that worked desperately to save Kennedy's life. The bullet that had struck Kennedy behind the ear had fragmented, sending pieces of lead and bone fragments throughout his brain. The wound was similar in many ways to the head wound that had killed his brother John 5 years earlier in Dallas. Despite hours of surgery and the best available medical care, Kennedy's condition remained critical. The bullet had caused irreversible damage to his brainstem, and doctors held little hope for his recovery. For nearly 26 hours, Kennedy fought for his life as family members, friends, and political allies maintained a vigil at the hospital. Ethel Kennedy rarely left her husband's bedside, while other family members, including Senator Edward Kennedy, flew to Los Angeles to be with their brother. At 1:44 a.m. on June 6, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was 42 years old. The man who killed Robert Kennedy was a 24-year-old Palestinian immigrant named Sirhan Bashara Sirhan. Born in Jerusalem in 1944, Sirhan had come to the United States with his family in 1957, settling in California. Sirhan's background provided important clues about his motivations for the assassination. He had been born into the Palestinian Christian community in Jerusalem and had experienced the displacement and upheaval that accompanied the Arab-Israeli conflicts of the 1940s and 1950s. The Sirhan family had initially lived in New York before moving to California, where they struggled with poverty and cultural assimilation. Sirhan's father abandoned the family when Sirhan was young, leaving his mother to raise several children alone. Sirhan had shown early promise as a student, but had become increasingly troubled and isolated as he grew older. He had attended Pasadena City College, but had dropped out without graduating. He had worked various jobs, including as a stable hand at a horse racing track, but had been unable to establish a stable career or personal life. More significantly, Sirhan had developed an intense hatred for Israel and strong identification with the Palestinian cause. He had become increasingly radicalized by the Arab-Israeli conflict and had come to view American support for Israel as a betrayal of Palestinian rights. Sirhan's motivation for killing Robert Kennedy was directly related to Kennedy's support for Israel. During the 1968 campaign, Kennedy had made several statements supporting Israeli security and had promised to provide military aid to Israel if elected president. On May 26, 1968, exactly 1 year before the Six-Day War anniversary, Kennedy had given a speech in a Portland synagogue in which he promised to send 50 Phantom jets to Israel. This statement had enraged Sirhan, who saw Kennedy as an enemy of the Palestinian people. Investigators later discovered notebooks in Sirhan's room filled with anti-Kennedy writings and references to killing the senator. One entry, dated May 18, 1968, read, "My determination to eliminate RFK is becoming more of an unshakable obsession. Kennedy must die before June 5th. The June 5th date was significant because it marked the first anniversary of the beginning of the Six-Day War, during which Israel had achieved decisive military victories over its Arab neighbors. For Sirhan, killing Kennedy on this anniversary date would be a symbolic act of revenge against American support for Israel. The investigation into Kennedy's assassination was more straightforward than many other high-profile political murders of the era. Sirhan had been caught in the act by dozens of witnesses, and there was no question about his identity or his guilt in the shooting. However, the investigation did reveal some puzzling aspects of the case that would fuel conspiracy theories for decades to come. The ballistics evidence. The bullet that killed Kennedy had been fired from Sirhan's gun at extremely close range, probably no more than a few inches from Kennedy's head. However, witnesses placed Sirhan several feet in front of Kennedy when he opened fire, raising questions about how the fatal shot could have been fired from such close range behind Kennedy's ear. The number of shots. Sirhan's revolver could hold only 8 bullets, and investigators accounted for 8 shots fired in the pantry. However, some analysts claim that the number of bullet holes found in the pantry walls and woodwork exceeded 8, suggesting that more shots had been fired than Sirhan's gun could have held. Witness accounts. Several witnesses reported seeing a woman in a polka dot dress fleeing the hotel after the shooting and yelling, "We shot Kennedy." However, investigators were never able to identify this woman or confirm her existence. Sirhan's behavior. Sirhan appeared to be in a trance-like state during and after the shooting, leading some observers to suggest that he might have been hypnotically programmed or drugged. However, medical examinations found no evidence of drug use or mental incapacitation. Sirhan's trial began on January 7, 1969, in Los Angeles Superior Court. The case was prosecuted by Lynn Compton and David Fitz, while Sirhan was represented by Grant Cooper, a prominent criminal defense attorney. The defense strategy centered on arguing that Sirhan was mentally ill and had not been capable of premeditated murder. Cooper presented evidence of Sirhan's troubled childhood, his family's displacement from Palestine, and his increasing psychological instability in the months before the assassination. Psychiatric experts testified that Sirhan suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and other mental disorders that had impaired his ability to distinguish right from wrong. The defense argued that while Sirhan had physically committed the crime, his mental illness made him less culpable than a fully rational defendant. The prosecution countered that Sirhan had clearly planned the assassination in advance, as evidenced by his notebooks and his deliberate decision to attend Kennedy's victory celebration at the Ambassador Hotel. They argued that his political motivations and careful preparation demonstrated that he was mentally competent and fully responsible for his actions. Sirhan himself provided little help to either side during the trial. He testified briefly but gave confused and contradictory answers about his motivations and memories of the shooting. At one point, he insisted that he wanted to plead guilty to first-degree murder against his attorney's advice. On April 17, 1969, the jury found Sirhan guilty of first-degree murder and assault with intent to commit murder. The jury also found that the murder was premeditated and recommended the death penalty. Judge Herbert Walker sentenced Sirhan to death in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. However, in 1972, the California Supreme Court ruled that the state's death penalty statute was unconstitutional, and Sirhan's sentence was commuted to life in prison. Despite the seemingly straightforward nature of the case, the Kennedy assassination has generated numerous conspiracy theories and alternative interpretations over the decades. Second gunman theory. Some researchers have argued that the ballistics evidence indicates that Kennedy was shot by a second gunman positioned behind him, while Sirhan served as a distraction in front of him. This theory is based primarily on the close-range nature of the fatal shot and the trajectory of the bullet. CIA government conspiracy. Some theorists have suggested that Sirhan was programmed or manipulated by government agencies as part of a broader conspiracy to eliminate political leaders who oppose the Vietnam War or other government policies. However, no credible evidence has ever been found to support these claims. Security guard theory. Investigative journalist Dan Mulder and others have suggested that Kennedy might have been accidentally shot by Thane Eugene Cesar, a security guard who was walking directly behind Kennedy when the shooting began. However, this theory has been disputed by ballistics experts and other investigators. Palestinian conspiracy. Some have suggested that Sirhan was part of a broader Palestinian terrorist conspiracy to kill Kennedy. However, investigators found no evidence that Sirhan was connected to any terrorist organizations or had received assistance from others. Over the years, various official and unofficial investigations have re-examined the evidence in the Kennedy assassination. LAPD reinvestigation, 1975. The Los Angeles Police Department conducted a comprehensive review of the case and concluded that Sirhan had acted alone and that no credible evidence existed to support conspiracy theories. Acoustic evidence analysis. In the 1980s, researchers analyzed audio recordings from the Ambassador Hotel and claimed to have found evidence of more gunshots than Sirhan's revolver could have fired. However, later analysis disputed these findings. Ballistics re-examination. Multiple ballistics experts have re-examined the physical evidence over the decades, with most concluding that all shots came from Sirhan's gun and that the ballistics evidence is consistent with Sirhan being the sole shooter. Sirhan Bashara Sirhan has remained in prison since his conviction in 1969, making him one of the longest-serving prisoners in California history. He has been housed at various facilities, including San Quentin and Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility. Over the decades, Sirhan has made numerous attempts to gain parole, all of which have been denied. During parole hearings, he has expressed varying degrees of remorse for his actions, though he has continued to maintain that he has no clear memory of the shooting itself. Some members of the Kennedy family, particularly Robert F. Kennedy Jr., have supported Sirhan's parole, arguing that he was not the actual assassin and that keeping him in prison serves no useful purpose. However, other family members have opposed his release. In 2021, a California parole board recommended Sirhan for parole after finding that he no longer posed a threat to public safety. However, California Governor Gavin Newsom ultimately reversed the parole board's decision, citing the exceptional circumstances of the crime and its impact on American society. Robert Kennedy's assassination had profound and lasting effects on American politics and society. His death eliminated a candidate who many believed could have united the Democratic Party and won the presidency in 1968, potentially changing the course of American history. Kennedy's death contributed to the chaos at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where Vice President Hubert Humphrey won the nomination amid violent protests and police confrontations. The divisions within the Democratic Party helped elect Republican Richard Nixon to the presidency. The assassination also marked a turning point in American politics, contributing to a growing sense that violence had become an acceptable means of political expression. The murders of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert F. Kennedy within a 5-year period created a climate of fear and cynicism that would influence American politics for decades. Robert Kennedy's assassination led to significant changes in security procedures for political candidates. At the time of his death, Kennedy had no Secret Service protection, relying instead on a small team of private bodyguards and volunteer security personnel. Following the assassination, Congress quickly passed legislation extending Secret Service protection to all major presidential candidates. The law also provided protection for former presidents and their families, recognizing that political figures faced ongoing security threats even after leaving office. The changes in security procedures would fundamentally alter the nature of political campaigning in America, making it much more difficult for candidates to interact spontaneously with voters and creating the heavily secured political events that are now standard in American politics. Robert Kennedy's assassination represents one of the great what-if moments in American history. Many historians and political observers believe that Kennedy would have won the Democratic nomination and possibly the presidency in 1968, potentially leading to very different policies on Vietnam, civil rights, and social programs. Kennedy had demonstrated a unique ability to appeal to diverse constituencies, particularly minorities and working-class whites, who were beginning to drift away from the Democratic Party. His death may have accelerated the political realignment that would eventually lead to Republican dominance in presidential elections. The assassination also highlighted the dangers of political extremism and the ease with which individuals with radical views could obtain weapons and access to political figures. Sirhan's act demonstrated how international conflicts and ideological grievances could manifest in violence against American political leaders. More than 5 decades after the assassination, certain aspects of the case continue to generate debate and controversy. The ballistics evidence. Questions persist about the trajectory and close-range nature of the fatal shot, though most experts continue to conclude that all shots came from Sirhan's gun. Witness testimony. Conflicting witness accounts about the woman in the polka dot dress and other details continue to fuel speculation about possible conspirators. Sirhan's mental state. Debates continue about whether Sirhan was mentally competent at the time of the shooting and whether his apparent memory loss is genuine or feigned. Parole considerations. Ongoing debates about whether Sirhan should be granted parole reflect broader questions about justice, punishment, and the possibility of redemption for those who commit heinous crimes. The assassination of Robert F. Kennedy stands as one of the most tragic and consequential crimes in American political history. Unlike some other political assassinations that have generated extensive conspiracy theories, the basic facts of the Kennedy case are relatively clear. Sirhan Bashara Sirhan shot and killed Senator Kennedy because of his support for Israel and his perceived betrayal of the Palestinian cause. However, the broader implications of the assassination continue to resonate through American politics and society. Kennedy's death eliminated a political leader who might have been able to heal some of the divisions that were tearing the country apart in the late 1960s. His assassination contributed to a cycle of political violence that would shape American politics for generations. The case also raises important questions about the intersection of international conflicts and domestic politics, the role of political extremism in American society, and the ongoing challenges of protecting political figures in a democratic society that values accessibility and openness. Sirhan Bashara Sirhan remains in prison more than 50 years after committing his crime, a living reminder of how a single act of violence can alter the course of history. His continued imprisonment reflects not just the severity of his crime, but the lasting impact that Robert Kennedy's death had on American society. The shots fired in the Ambassador Hotel kitchen on that June night in 1968 didn't just end the life of a promising political leader. They helped end an era of American optimism and contributed to a growing sense that the country's problems might be too deep and complex to be solved through traditional democratic processes. Today, as America continues to grapple with political divisions and the threat of political violence, Robert Kennedy's assassination serves as both a warning about the dangers of extremism and a reminder of the leadership and vision that was lost when he died. His death marked the end of the Kennedy political dynasty's greatest promise and the beginning of a more cynical and divided era in American politics. Story 4. The O.J. Simpson Case, the Trial of the Century. On the evening of June 12, 1994, 2 brutal murders in Brentwood, California would launch what became known as the Trial of the Century. The victims were Nicole Brown Simpson, the ex-wife of former NFL superstar O.J. Simpson, and Ronald Goldman, a 25-year-old waiter who was returning sunglasses Nicole had left at the restaurant where he worked. The case would expose deep racial divisions in America, challenge the credibility of the Los Angeles Police Department, and forever change how the public viewed celebrity, race, and the criminal justice system. Nicole Brown Simpson was 35 years old at the time of her death, a beautiful blonde who had met O.J. Simpson in 1977 when she was just 18 years old and working as a waitress at a Beverly Hills nightclub called the Daisy. Simpson was 29 at the time, already a famous NFL running back and actor. Despite their 11-year age difference, they began a relationship that would be marked by passion, volatility, and ultimately tragedy. Nicole and O.J. married in 1985, during the height of his fame as both a sports legend and popular spokesman for Hertz rental cars. They had two children together, Sydney, born in 1985, and Justin, born in 1988. From the outside, they appeared to be living the perfect California dream: wealth, fame, and a beautiful family in one of Los Angeles' most exclusive neighborhoods. However, behind closed doors, the marriage was troubled by O.J. S jealousy, possessiveness, and violent temper. Police records would later reveal a pattern of domestic violence dating back to 1985, just months after their wedding. Nicole had called police multiple times reporting physical abuse, but the incidents were often minimized due to O.J. S celebrity status. The couple divorced in 1992, but continued to have an on and off relationship that was marked by O.J. S attempts to reconcile and Nicole's growing independence. Friends later testified that Nicole had become increasingly fearful of O.J. in the months before her death, telling several people that she believed he might kill her. Ronald Goldman was an aspiring actor and model who worked as a waiter at Messaluna, an upscale Italian restaurant in Brentwood, where Nicole was a regular customer. Born in 1968, Goldman had moved to Los Angeles from Chicago to pursue his dreams in the entertainment industry. He was known as a friendly, ambitious young man who was well-liked by both customers and coworkers. On the night of his death, Goldman was simply doing a favor for a customer, returning sunglasses that Nicole had accidentally left at the restaurant earlier that evening. This act of kindness would cost him his life and make him forever linked to one of the most famous murder cases in American history. The murders occurred outside Nicole's condominium at 875 South Bundy Drive in Brentwood, an upscale area of West Los Angeles. The crime scene was discovered at approximately 12:10 a.m. on June 13, 1994, by a neighbor who was walking her dog. Nicole's body was found at the bottom of the steps leading to her front door, lying in a pool of blood. Her throat had been slashed so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. The wound went down to her cervical vertebrae. She also had multiple defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating she had fought desperately for her life. Ronald Goldman's body was found nearby, slumped against a tree in a small alcove next to the walkway. He had suffered multiple stab wounds to his neck and torso, as well as defensive wounds that showed he had struggled fiercely with his attacker. A black knit cap and a bloody leather glove were found near the bodies. The crime scene suggested a frenzied personal attack rather than a random robbery. Nothing was stolen from either victim, and the level of violence, particularly the near decapitation of Nicole, indicated extreme rage on the part of the killer. Blood evidence at the scene would become crucial to the case. Drops of blood were found leading away from the bodies toward the back gate of Nicole's property, suggesting the killer had been injured during the attack. Additional blood was found on the back gate itself. The Los Angeles Police Department's investigation began within hours of the discovery of the bodies. Given Nicole's connection to O.J. Simpson, one of the most famous athletes in America, the case immediately attracted intense media attention. Detective Mark Furman was among the first officers to arrive at the crime scene. Furman, a 20-year veteran of the LAPD, noted the brutality of the murders and began collecting evidence. The investigation quickly focused on O.J. Simpson when detectives learned of his tumultuous relationship with his ex-wife and his history of domestic violence. At approximately 5 a.m. on June 13th, detectives went to Simpson's mansion at 360 North Rockingham Avenue in Brentwood to notify him of his ex-wife's death. When they arrived, they found Simpson's white Ford Bronco parked outside, but no one answered the door. Detective Furman noted what appeared to be blood on the driver's door of the Bronco and became concerned for Simpson's safety. Using this as justification, the detectives entered Simpson's property without a warrant, a decision that would later become a major issue in the case. On the grounds of Simpson's estate, investigators made several crucial discoveries. They found a bloody leather glove behind the guest house that appeared to match the glove found at the crime scene. They also found blood drops leading from Simpson's Bronco to his front door and blood in his foyer and bathroom. When Simpson was finally reached by phone in Chicago, where he had flown the night of the murders, he seemed surprisingly calm and unemotional about news of Nicole's death, according to the detectives. He agreed to return to Los Angeles immediately. As the investigation progressed, evidence began to mount against O.J. Simpson. Blood evidence, DNA testing of blood found at the crime scene, on the glove at Simpson's house in his Bronco, and in his home showed matches to Simpson, Nicole, and Goldman. The odds against the blood being from someone other than Simpson were calculated in the hundreds of millions to one. The gloves, the bloody glove found at Simpson's home, appeared to be a match for the glove found at the crime scene. Both were expensive Eris light gloves, size extra large, and of the same rare style that Nicole had purchased for OJ in 1990. Hair and fiber evidence. Hair consistent with Simpson's was found on the knit cap at the crime scene. Fibers consistent with the carpet in Simpson's Bronco were found on the glove at Rockingham. Footprint. Evidence bloody footprints at the crime scene were made by expensive Bruno Magli shoes, size 12, the same size Simpson wore. Only 299 pairs of these shoes were sold in the United States. Timeline evidence. Simpson could not account for his whereabouts during the time the murders occurred, approximately 10:15 to 10:40 p.m. on June 12th. He claimed to be at home, but no one could verify this. History of domestic violence. Police records documented multiple incidents of Simpson abusing Nicole, including a 1989 incident that resulted in Simpson pleading no contest to spousal abuse charges. On June 17, 1994, Simpson was scheduled to surrender to police but failed to appear. That evening, he was spotted in a white Ford Bronco driven by his friend Al Cowlings on Interstate 405. What followed was one of the most watched events in television history. The low-speed chase lasted nearly 2 hours and was broadcast live on television to an estimated 95 million viewers, one of the largest audiences in TV history. Simpson held a gun to his head during much of the chase while Cowlings drove at speeds rarely exceeding 35 miles per hour. The chase ended at Simpson's Brentwood home, where he was surrounded by police and eventually surrendered. Found in the Bronco were Simpson's passport, a disguise consisting of a fake mustache and goatee, and $8,750 in cash, items that prosecutors would later argue showed Simpson's intent to flee. Simpson assembled one of the most formidable legal teams in American history, dubbed the Dream Team by the media. The team included Johnny Cochran, the lead attorney, known for his charisma and his ability to connect with African-American jurors. Cochran would make the case about race and police misconduct rather than just the evidence. Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard law professor and appeals expert who helped develop the legal strategy and handled constitutional issues. F. Lee Bailey, a legendary criminal defense attorney known for his aggressive cross-examination style. Robert Shapiro, a well-connected Los Angeles attorney who initially led the defense team before being overshadowed by Cochran. Robert Kardashian, Simpson's longtime friend who reactivated his law license to join the defense team. The Dream Team's strategy was multifaceted. They would argue that Simpson was the victim of a rush to judgment by racist police officers, that evidence had been planted or contaminated, and that the real killers remained at large. The trial began on January 24, 1995, with Judge Lance Ito presiding. From the beginning, it was clear this would be unlike any murder trial in American history. The proceedings were televised live on multiple networks, turning participants into celebrities, and the courtroom into a stage for America's racial and cultural divisions. Jury selection. The jury selection process took nearly 2 months and revealed the deep racial divide in perceptions of the case. The final jury consisted of 9 African Americans, 2 whites, and 1 Hispanic, a composition that strongly favored the defense. Opening statements. Prosecutor Marcia Clark laid out what seemed like an overwhelming case against Simpson, detailing the mountain of physical evidence linking him to the murders. Defense attorney Johnny Cochran countered by arguing that Simpson was the victim of a racist conspiracy by the LAPD. The prosecution's case? The prosecution, led by Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, presented evidence including DNA blood evidence linking Simpson to both crime scenes, the matching gloves, and other physical evidence, Simpson's history of domestic violence against Nicole, his lack of an alibi for the time of the murders, evidence of his jealousy and obsession with Nicole. The defense strategy. The Dream Team's strategy was to put the LAPD on trial rather than defend Simpson's innocence directly. They argued that evidence had been planted by racist officers and that the investigation had been botched from the beginning. Several moments during the trial became defining images of the case. The glove demonstration. In one of the trial's most dramatic moments, prosecutor Christopher Darden asked Simpson to try on the bloody gloves in front of the jury. The gloves appeared to be too small, prompting Cochran's famous phrase, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." The defense later argued that the gloves had shrunk from being soaked in blood and that Simpson was wearing latex gloves underneath. Detective Mark Furman, the detective who found key evidence, became a central figure in the defense strategy. When audio tapes surfaced of Furman using racial slurs and describing police misconduct, it devastated his credibility and reinforced the defense argument about racist police officers. The DNA evidence. While the DNA evidence against Simpson was overwhelming from a scientific standpoint, the defense successfully confused the jury by attacking the collection and handling of the evidence, suggesting contamination and planting. Domestic violence evidence. Judge Ito limited the amount of domestic violence evidence the prosecution could present, a decision that many legal experts believe significantly weakened the prosecution's case. On October 3, 1995, after deliberating for only 4 hours, the jury returned not guilty verdicts on all charges. The verdict exposed America's racial divide like few events before or since. Polls showed that most African Americans believed the verdict was correct, while most whites believed Simpson was guilty. The speed of the deliberation shocked many legal observers, given the complexity of the evidence and the 9-month length of the trial. The brief deliberations suggested that the jury had made up their minds well before closing arguments. Simpson's reaction to the verdict, a subtle but noticeable smile and nod, was captured by cameras and became one of the most analyzed moments in television history. For many, it seemed to confirm his guilt rather than celebrate his innocence. In 1996, the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Simpson in civil court. The civil trial operated under different rules than the criminal trial. The standard of proof was preponderance of the evidence rather than beyond a reasonable doubt. Simpson was required to testify on his own behalf. More domestic violence evidence was allowed. The jury was more diverse with a white majority. The civil trial lasted 4 months, and on February 4, 1997, the jury found Simpson liable for the wrongful deaths of both victims. He was ordered to pay $33.5 million in compensatory and punitive damages to the victims' families. Simpson's testimony during the civil trial was often contradictory and evasive, and many observers felt it significantly damaged his credibility. The different outcome in the civil trial highlighted how the burden of proof and jury composition could dramatically affect the result. In the years following the trial, additional evidence has emerged that many believe further implicates Simpson. The Bruno Malley photographs. In 1997, photographs surfaced showing Simpson wearing Bruno Malley shoes identical to those that made the bloody footprints at the crime scene. Simpson had previously denied ever owning such shoes. "If I did it." In 2006, Simpson wrote a book titled "If I Did It," which was presented as a hypothetical account of how he might have committed the murders. Many viewed the book as a thinly veiled confession. Additional witness testimony. Over the years, several people have come forward claiming Simpson confessed to them, though none of these accounts were available during the original trial. The O.J. Simpson case had profound and lasting impacts on American society. Race relations. The case exposed and exacerbated racial divisions in America. The vastly different reactions to the verdict along racial lines revealed how differently blacks and whites viewed the criminal justice system and police. Media coverage. The trial marked the beginning of the modern era of celebrity criminal trials and 24/7's cable news coverage. It launched careers and changed how the media covers high-profile cases. DNA evidence. The case introduced many Americans to DNA evidence for the first time and highlighted both its power and its limitations in the courtroom. Domestic violence. Awareness. Despite the acquittal, the case brought increased attention to the issue of domestic violence and the need for better police response to such cases. Legal system reforms. The case led to discussions about reforms in jury selection, evidence handling, and the use of expert witnesses in criminal trials. Simpson's legal troubles were far from over after his acquittal. In 2008, he was convicted on multiple felony charges, including kidnapping and armed robbery in connection with a confrontation at a Las Vegas hotel. He was sentenced to 33 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 9 years. Many observers saw the harsh sentence as a form of delayed justice for the murders, though the judge insisted the sentence was based solely on the Las Vegas crimes. Simpson was granted parole in 2017 after serving 9 years in prison. Despite Simpson's acquittal, many people continue to believe he was guilty of the murders. However, several alternative theories have been proposed. Drug connection. Some have suggested the murders were related to drug activity, though no credible evidence has emerged to support this theory. Other suspects. Various individuals have been proposed as alternative suspects, including Nicole's friend Faye Resnick and others in her social circle. But none of these theories have gained serious credibility. Simpson's son. Some conspiracy theorists have suggested that Simpson's son Jason might have been involved, but this theory is not supported by evidence and has been dismissed by investigators. More than 25 years after the murders, several questions continue to intrigue observers. The missing murder weapon. The knife used to kill Nicole and Ronald was never found, despite extensive searches. In 2016, a knife found on Simpson's former property generated media attention, but was quickly ruled out as the murder weapon. Simpson's injuries. Simpson had cuts on his hands around the time of the murders that he gave various explanations for, but the exact cause was never definitively established. The timeline. Questions remain about whether Simpson had enough time to commit the murders and return home, though most experts believe the timeline works. Additional evidence. Rumors persist about additional evidence that was never presented at trial, though none has been verified. The O.J. Simpson case has become a cultural touchstone, referenced in countless books, movies, documentaries, and television shows. It represents a watershed moment in American culture when the country was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about race, celebrity, and justice. The case has been the subject of extensive analysis and re-examination, including the Emmy-winning FX series, The People v. O.J. Simpson, the acclaimed ESPN documentary, O.J. Made in America, dozens of books by participants, observers, and analysts, ongoing academic study of its legal and social implications. Legal experts remain divided on various aspects of the case. The evidence. Most experts agree that the physical evidence against Simpson was overwhelming, but they debate whether it was presented effectively by the prosecution. The defense strategy. Many praise the Dream Team's strategy of putting the LAPD on trial, though others argue it diverted attention from the evidence. The jury opinions differ on whether the jury made the right decision based on the evidence presented to them, or whether they were influenced by factors beyond the evidence. The prosecution. Critics argue that the prosecution made crucial tactical errors, including the glove demonstration and the decision to have Simpson try on the gloves in front of the jury. The O.J. Simpson case stands as one of the most significant criminal trials in American history, not just for its celebrity defendant, but for what it revealed about American society. The case exposed deep racial divisions, highlighted problems with the criminal justice system, and demonstrated the power of skilled legal representation. Whether one believes Simpson was guilty or innocent, the case raised important questions about how race, celebrity, and wealth influence the administration of justice in America. The vastly different reactions to the verdict along racial lines showed how the same evidence could be interpreted completely differently depending on one's perspective and experiences. The mountain of evidence against Simpson, the DNA, the gloves, the domestic violence history, the lack of an alibi, convinced most legal experts of his guilt. Yet the defense team's skillful presentation of police misconduct and racial bias created reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors who mattered most. The case also demonstrated the importance of how evidence is presented in court. Scientific evidence that seemed overwhelming to experts was successfully challenged by defense attorneys who understood that winning over a jury required more than just facts. It required a compelling narrative that resonated with the jurors' experiences and beliefs. More than 25 years later, the O.J. Simpson case continues to fascinate and divide Americans. It serves as a reminder of how a single criminal trial can become a mirror reflecting society's deepest tensions and contradictions. The murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were tragic crimes that destroyed families and changed lives forever. But the trial that followed became something larger, a national referendum on race, justice, and the American dream. The case will likely continue to be debated and analyzed for generations to come, serving as a permanent reminder of a moment when America was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. In that sense, the O.J. Simpson case was indeed the trial of the century, not just because of its celebrity participants, but because of what it revealed about the country in which it took place. Whether justice was ultimately served remains a matter of perspective, shaped by one's views on race, the legal system, and the nature of reasonable doubt. What cannot be disputed is that two people lost their lives in a brutal attack, and that tragedy continues to reverberate through American culture and consciousness decades later. Story 5. The Assassination of Malcolm X, February 21st, 1965. The afternoon of February 21st, 1965, was cold and crisp in New York City as people gathered at the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights for what would become one of the most significant and controversial assassinations in American history. Malcolm X, the fiery civil rights leader who had undergone a dramatic transformation from Nation of Islam minister to international human rights advocate, was scheduled to address the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Instead, gunfire would erupt in the ballroom, ending the life of one of America's most influential and polarizing figures at just 39 years old. Malcolm X had been living under constant threat of death for nearly a year. His break from the Nation of Islam in March 1964 had made him a target of the organization he had served faithfully for over a decade. His house had been firebombed just 1 week earlier, and he had told close associates that he expected to be killed soon. Yet on that Sunday afternoon, he walked onto the stage of the Audubon Ballroom to deliver what would be his final speech. Born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1925, the man who would become Malcolm X had experienced a childhood marked by racism, violence, and tragedy. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist minister and follower of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement. The family faced constant harassment from white supremacist groups, and when Malcolm was 6 years old, his father died in what was officially ruled a streetcar accident, but which the family believed was murder. Malcolm's mother, Louise Little, struggled to raise 8 children alone during the Great Depression. The stress eventually led to her mental breakdown, and she was institutionalized when Malcolm was 13. The children were scattered among foster homes and state institutions, beginning Malcolm's lifelong mistrust of white authority figures and social systems. As a young man, Malcolm drifted into a life of crime in Boston and New York City, dealing drugs, running numbers, and committing burglary. In 1946, at age 20, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for burglary. It was behind bars that Malcolm encountered the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, a religious movement that preached black supremacy and separation from white society. The Nation of Islam's message resonated powerfully with Malcolm. He converted to the faith, adopted the surname X to represent his lost African identity, and became a voracious reader and self-educated intellectual. Upon his release from prison in 1952, Malcolm quickly rose through the ranks of the Nation of Islam, becoming its most effective minister and spokesperson. Malcolm X's intelligence, charisma, and uncompromising rhetoric made him the most visible and controversial figure in the Nation of Islam during the 1950s and early 1960s. While Martin Luther King Jr. preached integration and nonviolence, Malcolm advocated for black separatism and armed self-defense. His message of black pride and rejection of white liberalism attracted thousands of followers, particularly in urban areas where civil rights progress seemed slow and insufficient. Malcolm's media appearances and debates with civil rights leaders made him a national figure, though often a reviled one among white Americans in mainstream civil rights organizations. His articulate advocacy for black nationalism and his critiques of American racism were both feared and respected, even by his opponents. The Nation of Islam grew dramatically under Malcolm's influence, establishing mosques and businesses throughout the country. Malcolm became Elijah Muhammad's most trusted lieutenant and heir apparent, traveling extensively to spread the organization's message and recruit new members. However, by the early 1960s, cracks began to appear in Malcolm's relationship with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. Malcolm was becoming increasingly interested in Orthodox Islam and international human rights issues, while the nation remained focused on its specific theology and separatist agenda. More troubling to Malcolm were rumors about Elijah Muhammad's personal conduct, including allegations of sexual impropriety with young female followers. The tension between Malcolm and the Nation of Islam came to a head following President Kennedy's assassination in November 1963. When asked for comment, Malcolm remarked that Kennedy's death was a case of chickens coming home to roost, suggesting that America's climate of violence had claimed one of its own leaders. The comment created a firestorm of controversy and gave Elijah Muhammad an opportunity to silence his increasingly independent lieutenant. Muhammad suspended Malcolm from speaking publicly for 90 days, but it became clear that the suspension was indefinite. Feeling betrayed by the man he had served faithfully for over a decade, Malcolm began to question everything about the Nation of Islam, including its theology and leadership. In March 1964, Malcolm announced his departure from the Nation of Islam. He declared his intention to form his own religious organization and to take a more active role in the mainstream civil rights movement. This decision immediately made him a marked man within the Nation of Islam, which viewed defection as the ultimate betrayal punishable by death. Shortly after leaving the Nation of Islam, Malcolm embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca that would fundamentally transform his worldview. In Saudi Arabia, he encountered Muslims of all races, worshiping together as equals, an experience that challenged his previous beliefs about the inherent evil of white people. Malcolm's letters from Mecca revealed a man undergoing a profound spiritual and intellectual transformation. He wrote of seeing blonde-haired, blue-eyed men I could call my brothers, and began to embrace the possibility of racial cooperation and understanding. He adopted the name El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz and began to articulate a more inclusive vision of human rights that transcended racial boundaries. Upon his return to the United States, Malcolm founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity, modeled after the Organization of African Unity. His new organization focused on human rights rather than civil rights, seeking to internationalize the struggle of African Americans by connecting it to anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia. This evolution in Malcolm's thinking made him even more dangerous to the Nation of Islam, which saw his new message as a repudiation of everything they had taught him. It also made him a potential ally to mainstream civil rights leaders, though relationships remained strained due to years of mutual antagonism. As 1964 progressed into 1965, threats against Malcolm's life intensified. Nation of Islam publications denounced him as a traitor and hypocrite, using language that many interpreted as calls for violence. Malcolm received numerous death threats and began traveling with bodyguards, though he often expressed fatalistic acceptance of his likely fate. The tension escalated dramatically in February 1965. On February 14th, Malcolm's home in Queens was firebombed while he and his family slept inside. Though no one was seriously injured, the attack clearly demonstrated that his enemies were prepared to kill him and were willing to endanger his wife Betty and their 4 young daughters. Malcolm publicly blamed the Nation of Islam for the firebombing, though he also suspected government involvement in the plot against him. He had been under FBI surveillance since the 1950s, and he believed that law enforcement agencies were at minimum allowing the Nation of Islam to threaten him without interference. In the days following the firebombing, Malcolm's security concerns intensified. He varied his routines, changed his travel plans frequently, and expressed growing paranoia about potential assassins. Yet he continued his public speaking schedule, driven by his sense of mission and perhaps by a belief that running from his fate was futile. February 21st, 1965, began like many other days for Malcolm X, but there were signs of unusual tension. The meeting at the Audubon Ballroom was organized by Malcolm's Organization of Afro-American Unity, and he had personally requested that his usual security team not search audience members for weapons, apparently wanting to create a more welcoming atmosphere. The Audubon Ballroom was located at 3940 Broadway in Washington Heights, a venue Malcolm had used frequently for OAAU meetings. The ballroom could hold about 400 people, though attendance that day was lighter than usual. Only about 150 people were present when Malcolm took the stage at approximately 3 p.m. Malcolm appeared nervous and agitated as he began his speech, interrupting himself several times and seeming distracted. He told the audience that he had been having second thoughts about some of the harsh things he had said about Elijah Muhammad, suggesting he wanted to focus on building his own organization rather than attacking his former mentor. About 10 minutes into his remarks, a disturbance broke out in the audience. 2 men in the front rows began shouting at each other, with one yelling, "Get your hands out of my pocket!" The commotion drew everyone's attention, including Malcolm's, as he called for calm, saying, "Cool it, brothers." At that moment, as Malcolm stood behind the podium trying to restore order, 3 men rushed toward the stage with guns drawn. The assassination unfolded with terrifying speed. As Malcolm tried to calm the disturbance in the audience, a man later identified as Talmadge Hayer, also known as Thomas Hagen, approached the stage from the right side of the ballroom. At the same time, two other men, later identified as Norman 3X Butler and Thomas 15X Johnson, moved toward the stage from the center of the audience. Hayer was carrying a sawed-off shotgun concealed under his coat. When he was approximately 8 feet from the stage, he pulled out the weapon and fired directly at Malcolm's chest. The blast struck Malcolm with devastating force, knocking him backward and sending the podium crashing to the floor. As Malcolm fell, Butler and Johnson opened fire with handguns, shooting him multiple times as he lay defenseless on the stage. The entire attack lasted no more than 15 seconds. But by the time it was over, Malcolm X had been struck by at least 15 bullets and shotgun pellets. Chaos erupted in the ballroom as audience members screamed, dove for cover, and fled toward the exits. Several of Malcolm's associates rushed onto the stage to help him, while others pursued the gunmen who were trying to escape. Malcolm's wife, Betty, who was pregnant with twins, had attended the meeting with their 4 daughters. She rushed onto the stage and cradled Malcolm's head as he lay dying, blood pooling beneath his body. According to witnesses, Malcolm was still conscious for a few moments after the shooting, but was unable to speak due to his massive injuries. The response to the shooting was swift but chaotic. Police and ambulances arrived within minutes, and Malcolm was rushed to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. However, the damage was too severe. He was pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m., just 30 minutes after the attack began. In the confusion following the shooting, one of the gunmen, Talmadge Hayer, was captured by Malcolm's supporters in the ballroom. As he tried to flee, he was tackled and beaten by several men, including Malcolm's bodyguard, Gene Roberts. When police arrived, they had to protect Hayer from the angry crowd that wanted to lynch him on the spot. The other 2 alleged gunmen, Butler and Johnson, managed to escape the immediate scene, though they were arrested within days. Their identification came primarily from eyewitness testimony, though the reliability of these identifications would later become a subject of intense controversy. Betty Shabazz, devastated by the loss of her husband, maintained her composure in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. She later recalled that Malcolm had seemed to know his death was imminent and had told her just days before that he might not live to see their unborn children. The New York Police Department's investigation into Malcolm's assassination was extensive but controversial from the beginning. The case was assigned to Detective John Keeley and other veteran investigators, who immediately focused on the 3 men who had been identified as the shooters. Talmadge Hayer had been caught at the scene with a .45 caliber pistol and was clearly guilty of participating in the assassination. Under questioning, he initially denied any involvement but later admitted to shooting Malcolm. However, he consistently claimed that he had acted with different accomplices than those identified by police. Norman 3, X Butler, and Thomas 15. X Johnson were both members of the Nation of Islam's Mosque No. 7 in Harlem, the same mosque where Malcolm had served as minister. Both men had criminal records and were known to be hostile to Malcolm following his departure from the organization. The evidence against Butler and Johnson consisted primarily of eyewitness testimony from people who claimed to have seen them in the ballroom during the shooting. However, the reliability of these identifications was questionable, given the chaos and confusion that followed the attack. More problematically, both Butler and Johnson had alibis for the time of the shooting. Butler was reportedly at home recovering from a leg injury that required him to walk with a cane, while Johnson was said to have been at a Nation of Islam meeting in the Bronx. However, these alibis were not thoroughly investigated by police, who seemed convinced of their guilt based on the eyewitness testimony. From the beginning, investigators focused on the Nation of Islam as the organization behind Malcolm's assassination. The motive was clear. Malcolm had been branded a traitor by the organization's leadership, and NOI publications had essentially called for his death in the months leading up to the shooting. Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, publicly denied any involvement in the assassination, but his followers had made no secret of their hatred for Malcolm. Louis Farrakhan, who had replaced Malcolm as minister of Mosque No. 7, had written in the NOI newspaper that Malcolm was worthy of death. The investigation revealed that several Nation of Islam members had been conducting surveillance of Malcolm in the weeks before his death. Phone records showed calls between NOI mosques and suggested coordination of activities related to Malcolm's movements. However, the investigation also revealed troubling gaps in security and intelligence gathering that raised questions about possible government involvement or complicity in the assassination. Malcolm X had been under extensive FBI surveillance since the 1950s, when J. Edgar Hoover's bureau began monitoring him as a potential threat to national security. The FBI's files on Malcolm eventually grew to over 2,000 pages and documented extensive surveillance of his activities, communications, and associates. The FBI's counterintelligence program, known as COINTELPRO, had been actively working to disrupt and discredit Black nationalist organizations, including the Nation of Islam. The program used informants, provocateurs, and disinformation campaigns to create internal conflicts within these organizations. Gene Roberts, one of Malcolm's bodyguards who tried to save his life after the shooting, was later revealed to be an undercover NYPD officer who had infiltrated Malcolm's organization. This revelation raised questions about how much law enforcement knew about threats against Malcolm and whether they had done enough to protect him. The New York Police Department had received specific intelligence about threats against Malcolm's life in the days before the assassination. Despite this intelligence, security at the Audubon Ballroom was minimal, and no special precautions were taken to protect Malcolm during his speech. These facts led many to conclude that government agencies, while perhaps not directly involved in planning the assassination, had allowed it to happen by failing to provide adequate protection or by actively undermining Malcolm's security through their surveillance activities. The trial of the three alleged assassins began in December 1965, just 10 months after the assassination. The proceedings were held in Manhattan Criminal Court before Judge Charles Marks, with prosecutor Vincent Dermody leading the case for the state. The evidence presented against the defendants was largely circumstantial, relying heavily on eyewitness testimony from people who claimed to have seen Butler and Johnson in the ballroom during the shooting. However, the reliability of these witnesses was questionable, and several later recanted or changed their testimony. Talmadge Hayer's testimony became the most dramatic element of the trial. Initially, he had refused to cooperate with investigators, but during the trial, he made a surprising admission. He confessed to participating in the assassination, but insisted that Butler and Johnson were innocent. He claimed that his real accomplices were other Nation of Islam members who had not been arrested. Hayer's testimony created a dilemma for prosecutors and defense attorneys alike. His confession to participation in the crime was clearly damaging to his own case, but his insistence on the innocence of his co-defendants complicated the prosecution's theory of the case. The defense attorneys argued that their clients were victims of mistaken identity and that the real killers remained at large. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence linking Butler and Johnson to the crime scene and highlighted the inconsistencies in witness testimony. However, the prosecution maintained that all three men were part of a Nation of Islam conspiracy to kill Malcolm X, and that Hayer was simply trying to protect his fellow conspirators by claiming they were innocent. On March 11, 1966, after deliberating for 20 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts against all three defendants. They were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The verdicts were controversial from the beginning, with many observers questioning whether justice had truly been served. Hayer's insistence on the innocence of his co-defendants, combined with the circumstantial nature of the evidence, left lingering doubts about whether the right men had been convicted. Betty Shabazz expressed mixed feelings about the verdicts, saying that while she was glad the case was closed, she didn't believe the full truth about her husband's assassination had been revealed. She continued to believe that the conspiracy to kill Malcolm involved more people than just the three men who were convicted. The families of Butler and Johnson maintained their innocence throughout the legal proceedings and continued to fight for their exoneration in the years that followed. In the decades following the trial, new evidence emerged that cast further doubt on the convictions of Butler and Johnson. In the 1970s and 1980s, additional witnesses came forward claiming that they had seen the real killers and that Butler and Johnson were not among them. Most significantly, in 1977, Talmadge Hayer signed a detailed affidavit naming his real accomplices in the assassination. He identified 4 other Nation of Islam members as his partners in the plot and provided specific details about how the assassination was planned and carried out. According to Hayer's affidavit, the assassination was ordered by Nation of Islam leadership in Chicago and carried out by a team of 5 men from the organization's Newark mosque. Hayer claimed that Butler and Johnson had no involvement in the plot and were convicted based on mistaken eyewitness testimony. Despite these revelations, efforts to overturn the convictions of Butler and Johnson were unsuccessful for many years. The criminal justice system proved resistant to admitting that innocent men might have been convicted for one of the most significant political assassinations in American history. In 2021, more than 50 years after Malcolm X's assassination, Norman Butler, who had changed his name to Muhammad Aziz, and Thomas Johnson, who had changed his name to Khalil Islam, were finally exonerated of all charges in connection with the murder. The exoneration came after a 2-year investigation by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which concluded that both men had been wrongfully convicted. The investigation found that prosecutors and law enforcement had withheld crucial evidence that would have supported their innocence claims. The withheld evidence included FBI documents showing that the Bureau had informants present at the assassination who could have provided testimony about the real killers. Police reports indicating that Butler and Johnson were not the men seen fleeing the ballroom after the shooting. Evidence that prosecution witnesses had been pressured or coached to identify Butler and Johnson as the killers. The exoneration was particularly poignant for the families of the wrongly convicted men. Thomas Johnson had died in 2009, still fighting to clear his name, while Norman Butler had spent decades trying to prove his innocence while rebuilding his life after prison. Despite the exonerations and Hayer's detailed confessions, many questions about Malcolm X's assassination remain unanswered. The full extent of the conspiracy, the role of government agencies, and the identities of all the participants continue to be subjects of investigation and speculation. Recent documentaries and books have raised new questions about the assassination, including the possible involvement of additional government agencies beyond the FBI, the role of informants and provocateurs in escalating tensions between Malcolm and the Nation of Islam, whether the assassination was part of a broader government program to eliminate Black nationalist leaders. In 2022, Malcolm X's daughters filed a lawsuit against the FBI, CIA, and NYPD, alleging that government agencies were complicit in their father's assassination through their surveillance activities and failure to prevent his murder despite knowing about threats against his life. Malcolm X's assassination cut short the life of one of America's most important and evolving political thinkers. At the time of his death, he was moving toward a more inclusive vision of human rights that might have bridged the gap between Black nationalism and mainstream civil rights advocacy. His autobiography, completed just before his death with the help of Alex Haley, became one of the most influential books of the 20th century, introducing millions of readers to his intellectual journey and political evolution. The book's impact extended far beyond the African American community, inspiring liberation movements around the world. Malcolm's emphasis on Black pride, self-determination, and international solidarity influenced a generation of activists and helped lay the groundwork for the Black Power movement of the late 1960s. His critique of white liberalism and his advocacy for armed self-defense provided alternatives to the nonviolent integrationist approach of Martin Luther King Jr. The assassination also demonstrated the dangers faced by Black leaders who challenged existing power structures, whether they came from racist organizations, internal community conflicts, or government agencies seeking to maintain the status quo. Malcolm X's assassination was part of a broader pattern of political violence that characterized the 1960s. His murder came less than 2 years after President Kennedy's assassination and would be followed by the killings of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy in 1968. This pattern of assassination raised disturbing questions about American democracy and the ability of the political system to accommodate dissent and change through peaceful means. The targeting of leaders who advocated for fundamental social change suggested that powerful interests were willing to use violence to preserve existing arrangements. Malcolm's assassination also highlighted the particular dangers faced by African American leaders who challenged white supremacy. The history of lynching and racial violence in America created a context in which the murder of Black leaders could be seen as an extension of long-standing patterns of racial terrorism. The Malcolm X assassination case offers several important lessons about American justice, political violence, and the challenges of historical truth. The fallibility of the justice system. The wrongful convictions of Butler and Johnson demonstrate how eyewitness testimony, prosecutorial misconduct, and systemic bias can lead to innocent people being imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit. The role of government surveillance. The extensive FBI surveillance of Malcolm, combined with the presence of undercover officers in his organization, raises questions about the government's role in political assassinations and its responsibility to protect citizens from violence. The importance of historical investigation. The decades-long effort to uncover the truth about Malcolm's assassination shows how important it is to continue investigating historical crimes, even when official verdicts have been rendered. The power of redemption. Malcolm's own transformation from criminal to minister to human rights advocate demonstrates the potential for personal growth and change, making his early death even more tragic. The assassination of Malcolm X remains one of the most significant and troubling crimes in American history. While we now know that the three men originally convicted were not all guilty, and while Talmadge Hayer has provided detailed accounts of the real conspiracy, many questions about the killing remain unanswered. What is clear is that Malcolm X was killed at a moment when he was evolving into a more inclusive and potentially more effective advocate for human rights. His assassination robbed America of a brilliant mind and powerful voice at a crucial moment in the struggle for racial justice. The case also demonstrates the complexity of political violence in America and the multiple forces, organizational, governmental, and social, that can combine to silence dissenting voices. Malcolm's death was not just the result of a religious dispute within the Nation of Islam, but also a product of broader systems of surveillance, repression, and violence that targeted Black leaders who challenged existing power structures. Today, as America continues to grapple with issues of racial justice, political violence, and government accountability, the assassination of Malcolm X serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. His death reminds us of the costs of political extremism and the importance of protecting dissenting voices, while his life and evolution remind us of the power of intellectual courage and moral growth. The ballroom where Malcolm X was killed has been demolished, but his words and ideas continue to resonate around the world. His assassination was meant to silence his voice, but instead it helped ensure that his message of human dignity, self-determination, and international solidarity would echo through generations of activists and thinkers who continue to fight for justice and equality. In the end, Malcolm X's assassination reveals both the worst and best of America, the capacity for violence and injustice, but also the ongoing struggle for truth and redemption that makes progress possible even in the face of tragedy. Let the hush of the night wrap around you, and know this: some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.